started. I know people are still coming into the meeting room, but good day, everyone. I'm Joan Brzezinski, and I'm the director of the University of Minnesota China Center. Thank you for joining us for this webinar with Professor Erika Lee. It's a great day to be here, and thank you too to the Immigration History Research Center and the Global Programs and Strategy Alliance for their support. Before we start, I'll offer some participation tips. We'll take any questions that you have submitted through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen at the end of the program. We hope to answer as many questions as possible, but of course we might be limited by time. For any other questions or technical issues that you experience during the program, please use the chat function to connect with a panelist directly. Your chat will only be visible to that panelist. The program will be recorded and available later on our website. I now invite Associate Vice President and Dean for International Programs, Meredith McQuaid, to give a welcome. Can't hear you. She's muted.
Okay, lots of people controlling mics. Thank you, Haiyan. Well, welcome everyone. I want to begin by thanking Joan Brzezinski and Haiyan Wang and really the entire China Center for bringing this important topic to our dining room tables or our living rooms or our dens as we all try to make sense of what we're seeing and hearing and experiencing in this situation. And a huge thank you to Dr. Lee for sharing her expertise with us today. The University of Minnesota is committed to maintaining an inclusive and safe environment for all, whether we are physically together or not, and condemns all discriminatory behaviors, bias, and racism. President Gabel has reiterated that position and her belief in its importance several times in the last few weeks, and I'm confident will continue to do so. While the virus may have physically separated us, we must not let fear and misinformation separate us further. And if history has taught us anything, it's that we are stronger together even when we're separated by physical distance. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Meredith. The University of Minnesota China Center has served as a bridge between the University of Minnesota and China for more than 40 years. Our mission to build bridges of exchange, promote understanding, and facilitate academic and research collaborations between the US and China has never been more important. In the context of the deterioration of the US-China political and economic relationship, the rise of xenophobia has been alarming. Political responses to COVID-19 outbreak that stigmatize, exclude, and make certain populations more vulnerable to the violence are inexcusable and unconscionable. COVID-19 related expressions of racism and xenophobia have included harassment, hate speech, proliferation of discriminatory stereotypes, and conspiracy theories. In an environment where a single sneeze or cough can trigger harassment, it becomes imperative that we understand this xenophobia, its cultural and historic context, and take steps to call it out for what it is and support our Chinese and Chinese American colleagues, friends, and partners and neighbors as they get through this extremely challenging time. Now, I would like to introduce you to our speaker today, Professor Erika Lee. She is an award-winning American historian, director of the Immigration History Research Center, Regents Professor, Distinguished McKnight University Professor, and the Rudolph V. Belcoli Chair in Immigration History at the University of Minnesota. Her scholarly specialties include migration, race and ethnicity, xenophobia, immigration law, and public policy, Asian Americans, and transnational US history. She's authored and co-authored many publications which have received wide acclaim, including her last and most recent published book, America for Americans, A History of Xenophobia in the United States. She has been awarded numerous national and university fellowships and awards for her research, teaching, and leadership. She's an active public scholar and has been invited to speak at universities, historical societies, and communities and organizations around the globe. Please welcome Regents Professor Lee.
Thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. It's really wonderful to see how many people are joining us today. Thank you to Joan, Haiyan, and Meredith for organizing this event and helping to support this really imperative conversation and dialogue about xenophobia in the wake of COVID-19. If you're like me, you're either reading the news obsessively or trying to put your head in in the sand or underneath the comforter because the news is so challenging. I do note that we gather today in the wake of the latest announcement by President Trump to on his intention to sign an executive order that would temporarily end all immigration. This is something we need to keep an eye on. Haiyan, if you could start the first slide, please. So as this pandemic has spread, and certainly as we have, the United States has been the country with the largest number of COVID-19 cases, xenophobia and anti-Asian racism has also spread. We've seen how Chinese people, and I think it's really important to note that it's not just Chinese people, it's also individuals assumed to be Chinese or Asian, that they are being targeted based on their perceived race and national origin, and the belief that all Chinese or Asian peoples have the disease and are spreading the virus. Next slide, please. The first reports came from overseas in the days and weeks, the end of December, when Chinese authorities in Wuhan first reported the outbreak of the coronavirus to the World Health Organization. We saw that Chinese people were experiencing verbal and physical abuse in Britain. There were restaurants in Vietnam and Japan and Italy who were refusing entry to Chinese people. The French media played on the idea that the coronavirus was a 21st century version of the yellow peril. This is an old idea, first based in the early 19th century, that Asia and Asian peoples were intent on dominating the West. Next slide, please. Some Asian Americans have faced increasing hostility as the United States has become the country with the largest number of COVID-19 cases. Here in Minnesota, we've seen that many are not of Chinese descent, but are in fact Southeast Asian, demonstrating how historically and today, anti-Asian racism continues to lump all Asian and Asian appearing peoples together as a single threat. As the Star Tribune article revealed earlier this month, a Hmong American family returned to their house in the suburbs outside of Minneapolis and found a sign posted at their door. It said, "We're watching you. Take the Chinese virus back to China. We don't want you here infecting us with your diseases." It was signed, "Your Friendly Neighborhood." My message today is that the rise in racism and xenophobia that we're seeing during this public health crisis is both old and new. Next slide, please. The pandemic is reviving larger and older racist anti-immigrant narratives and policies. It's part of the United States' long history of xenophobia, meaning the irrational fear and hatred of immigrants. We've seen throughout our history that Americans have been wary of almost every group of foreigners who has come to the United States, whether it be German immigrants in the 18th century, or Irish and Chinese in the 19th, Italians, Jews, Japanese, and Mexicans in the 20th, and Muslims and Central Americans today. Across the centuries, Americans have labeled immigrants a threat because they were poor, because they practiced a different faith, because they were non-white. They've argued that there are too many immigrants, that they're not assimilating, that they're taking jobs away from deserving Americans, that they bring crime and disease into the country, that they had dangerous political ideals, were un-American, or even that they hated America. This cartoon is from a very popular American illustrated magazine called The Judge in 1903. You can see it's called "The High Tide of Immigration, a National Menace." And in it, it captures the danger of what was called riffraff immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, from Mexico and China. The argument was that they are coming in an unending flood to the United States, that they would take over the US, displace its native born, destroy American values and institutions. Next slide, please. The United States has often defined immigration as a crisis, likening the movement of peoples to an invasion of hostile forces requiring a military-like response in order to safeguard what the Ku Klux Klan called an America for Americans. As this pamphlet from the 1920s shows, xenophobia is a form of racism that has functioned alongside slavery, settler colonialism, conquest, segregation, and white supremacy. It has not been an exception to our welcome to immigration. It is, in fact, an American tradition in its own right, deeply embedded in our society, our economy, and politics. Next slide, please. In particular, disease and pandemics have played a special role in this history of xenophobia. Migrants have been likened to being parasites, to being an invasive population, a plague, an invisible threat. The president, in his tweet about his executive order last night, used the term an invisible enemy. And here we're not sure whether he's talking about the virus or immigrants, but in fact, it doesn't matter because we've seen historically how the two have been used sort of interchangeably as an invisible threat, like pathogens. This cartoon from a San Francisco magazine refers to Chinese immigration as a plague that is coming to infest the United States. The caption reads, 70 million of people are starving in the northern provinces of China. All who can do so are making preparation to come to the United States. Look out for the grasshoppers, Uncle Sam. Next slide, please. Immigrants have also been stigmatized as being carriers of dangerous diseases and contagion. They've been scapegoated for the public health crises of the day. In the 1790s, when yellow fever was coming to the United States, Americans blamed it on Germans and called it the German flu. In the 1830s and 1840s, Irish immigrants were blamed for bringing and spreading cholera. In 1890s, Jews were the targets of a typhoid epidemic. And this cartoon shows a Jewish immigrant who is bringing his religious superstition, but also poverty, anarchy, infidelity, and of course, disease into the United States. By 1916, it was Italians who were blamed for the spread of polio. And throughout the 20th century, Mexicans have been blamed for bringing vermin, filth, disease, and squalor, diseases like typhus, plague, and smallpox into the country. Next slide, please. But it's fitting during this presentation and this webinar that we talk about the special historic and contemporary role that China, Chinese people, Chinese spaces have played as being particularly racialized as sources of filth, as sources of epidemic disease and contagion that either was brought from overseas or was bred amongst the population and then threatens white America. They have been portrayed as an impending epidemic catastrophe, as this 1882 cartoon shows, a cartoon that's meant to portray San Francisco's Chinatown. Historians tell us that 19th century Americans routinely defined Chinatown as plague spots, as cesspools, laboratories of infection, as well as sites of crime, depravity, and unsanitary living conditions. Chinese were marked racially as distinctly different and threatening to white America. Next slide, please. These ideas were global ones. This idea that Chinese incubated incurable afflictions such as syphilis, trachoma, leprosy, bubonic plague, but also that they disguised them out in their outward appearance. So this caption is from a cartoon that was published in a 1932 anti-Chinese publication published in Mexico, a book that was really credited with pushing forward some of that country's anti-Chinese laws. And the caption here reads, "The terrible ills of the Orient, highly contagious, that the Chinese cover with very clean clothing when they work as waiters in cafes, as launderers, or domestic servants. This is sort of an early version of the model minority myth, in which on the outside, Chinese seem to be harmless. They have very clean clothing. They're very hardworking. They are sort of, assimilated, but you scratch the surface, or you take off the clothing, and they're in fact these horrific diseased individuals that are perhaps consciously spreading disease. Next slide, please. In addition, the allegedly strange eating habits of Chinese people were also seen as evidence of sickliness and contagious disease. Chinese ate rats, mice, bats, cats, and dogs, and then they spread disease. 19th century advertisements like this one were extremely popular in the United States. It likened Chinese to rat poison. Both Chinese people and this poison were good at exterminating rodents. Both were, quote unquote, rough on rats. Of course, another part of this message promoted the idea that Chinese were disease carriers. They ate these weird animals, animals that were diseased themselves, and then Chinese people would pass this on. In this way, public health discourses, public health understandings and policies about certain people used and adapted prevailing racist understandings of Chinese to then justify certain policies. Next slide, please. During the 1900 outbreak of bubonic plague in San Francisco, for example, the city ordered an immediate quarantine of Chinatown, where the first case was detected, with orders to remove all white residents from the area and keep and quarantine all Chinese within that 12-block area. The mayor at that time, a well-known anti-Chinese activist, also recommended that no Chinese be allowed to work outside of Chinatown. That same year, as this photograph shows, public health officials burned most of Chinatown and Honolulu down to destroy houses suspected of being infected with bubonic plague. Next slide, please. Other undesirable and threatening immigrants were also targets of certain public health policies that disproportionately impacted them. Medical inspections of Southern and Eastern Europeans on Ellis Island and Asian immigrants on Angel Island were used as weapons to restrict immigration from those areas. They were treated more harshly and judged more harshly than other immigrants. Next slide, please. For decades, US health authorities also used noxious, often toxic chemicals to delouse Mexicans seeking to cross the border into the United States. These included nude gasoline baths to kill lice, and also fumigations with DDT and other insecticides throughout much of the 20th century. The point here again is that public health crises feed on existing xenophobia and racism. It has been used to justify not only harsh public health measures that have disproportionately impacted immigrants, but also to justify immigration exclusion and deportation. Next slide, please. These laws have included the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, the first federal law to single out an entire group for immigration exclusion based on race and class. This cartoon is actually another advertisement, this time an advertisement for laundry soap. And here we see Uncle Sam literally kicking out the Chinese as he holds in his hand the proclamation of the law. And the caption below says, "We no longer need them," meaning the Chinese, because now we have this wonderful laundry soap. So in this way, it's using not only the Exclusion Act to justify this harsh action against Chinese immigrants, but also it's using the Exclusion Act to sell laundry soap. Next slide, please. Other immigration laws followed. The 1921 and 1924 Immigration Acts continued to allow immigrants in from Northern and Western Europe, largely considered the best immigrants, but basically closed America's gates to immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, as well as from Asia. Next slide, please. During the Great Depression, calls to quote unquote get rid of the Mexicans were shouted loudly and clearly in many states across the United States. Local officials worked with federal officials to forcibly remove several 100,000 Mexican and Mexican Americans from the country. This included 60% who were American citizens by birth, largely young children. Next slide, please. Today's virus-related xenophobia must be seen in relationship to this history, but also to the more recent larger backlash to immigration that began in the 1980s and 1990s. This is when conservative activists started waging a war that they called a war against illegal immigration. It drove the overhaul of federal welfare policies and immigration policies later that decade, passed and supported by both Democratic and Republican administrations. These laws barred undocumented immigrants from all public benefits, including education and health, laws that still stand in place today. The militarization of the US-Mexico border followed under President Clinton, and deterrence, detention, and deportation grew under Presidents Bush and Obama. Next slide, please. The backlash intensified during other public health crises. During the 1980s and 1990s, Haitians were stigmatized as public health risks because they were believed to be AIDS carriers. From 1993 until 2010, HIV was considered grounds for inadmissibility, meaning that HIV positive foreign nationals could be denied short-term visas or applications for lawful permanent residence simply because they had HIV status. Next slide, please. A similar epidemic of fear and racism followed the 2014 Ebola outbreak in West Africa. This disease was persistently portrayed as African, which contributed to and fed off of existing racism in the West and resulted in racist targeting of certain individuals and communities as the crisis worsened. Next slide, please. Today's xenophobia is a product of a political climate that is openly xenophobic and racist, one that has focused on building a great big wall along the Mexico border and a complete and total shutdown of Muslims coming to the United States during the past 4 years. It is also taking place amidst a rise in US-China tensions. The pandemic is feeding upon and escalating tensions between the United States and China. We see that in the US, the Trump administration is ramping up its accusations that China failed to identify, stop, and warn about the virus. It seems that the DNC is also following suit in this rhetoric. And then in China, foreign ministry officials have accused the US of defamation. Experts warn that the two countries will move even farther apart. Next slide, please. Both of these factors, US-China relations and contemporary xenophobia, have had dire consequences for Chinese and other Asian Americans. Specifically, we've seen how some politicians refer to COVID-19 as the Chinese virus, or the Wuhan virus, or the Kung flu. Actions which go against the advice and policy recommendations from medical experts and WHO to avoid names that might result in discriminatory behavior against places and ethnic groups. Next slide, please. Such actions have had real consequences. During the last week in March, we've seen over 650 racist acts that were reported. An online hate crime reporting tool registered more than 1,000 incidents in the last 2 weeks alone. And these are reported incidents. We know that so many of these incidents have gone unreported as well. Next slide, please. Asian American leaders and organizations are responding. Russell Jung, a professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State University, started tracking these attacks on a new website he helped to launch called Stop AAPI Hate. Next slide, please. Some states have launched helplines or hotlines to report coronavirus hate crimes and xenophobia directed at Asian Americans, including New York as well as Minnesota. Next slide, please. And other organizations are also responding, like bystander intervention training organized by Asian Americans Advancing Justice. the hope here is that not only will we be able to better track these incidents, but also stop them. Last slide, please. In the meantime, I'd like to add with these simple tips: wash your hands, and please don't be racist. Thank you very much. I look forward to answering questions.
Thank you, Erika. This was terrific. I really appreciate your presentation, and you provided all of us a lot of information to think about. We'll get started with a few questions that we did get earlier. So one asks, in my conversations with friends and family, I've often heard comments such as, "Thank goodness we live in Minnesota and not in the cities where we're hearing these reports of Asians who are getting acid thrown on them physically or assaulted." Meanwhile, I've witnessed people discounting the fear of a Chinese coworker who expressed fear of wearing a mask in public. This has bothered me, and I wondered if you could speak to the impact of the microaggressions in our community.
Well, I'm sorry, Erika Lee just got offline. I think she will be back in a minute.
Oh dear.
Okay. Erika's back now.
I'm back. I'm so sorry. Something happened and I got kicked off. So now I'm happy to answer questions.
Okay. Did you hear the question?
I did not. No,
Okay.
If you could repeat it, please.
Let's start again. So in my conversation with friends and family, I've heard comments such as, "Thank goodness we live in Minnesota and not in the cities where we are hearing reports of Asians who are getting acid thrown on them or physically assaulted." Meanwhile, I witnessed people discounting the fear of Chinese coworkers when they express wearing a mask in public. This has bothered me, and I wondered if you could speak to the impact of microaggressions in our community.
Yes, I think that's a fabulous question. I think, well, first of all, as the local reporting has shown, Asian Minnesotans are not immune to hate crimes like that Hmong American family experienced. How frightening to be targeted at one's home, and also clearly by people who are presumably your neighbors. So I don't think we can discount at all the types of fear and internal violence that kind of hate speech and hate acts do, even if it's not so physical. It's not as physical as, you know, that horrific account of acid being thrown on somebody. We use this term microaggressions to explain these more, you know, informal acts of racism rather than, you know, large-scale discriminatory policies or physical acts. But I think that sometimes that term helps to diminish the violence and that impact that prejudice and that hate can also do. So I would end with this message that this is happening in our community. This is happening in Minnesota. It's happening amongst, not just amongst people that we may not know, but apparently amongst our neighbors as well, and that we should not discount these social slights or other aspects of prejudice and xenophobia that our community is facing.
Thank you. So another question is, many of these efforts to combat the rise of anti-Chinese and other anti-Asian racism have been focused on Asian American community, which is suffering from it. In your years of observing this, are there any pointers for those among us of Western heritage to better fight these evils within our communities?
Absolutely. You know, so I think one of the, if there is a silver lining in all that we are facing today, it's that I think more and more people have become aware of how xenophobia works. And also, I think especially for Asian Americans and Chinese Americans, one thing that I've noticed with a lot of the reporting in the recent weeks is it seems that there is a trend amongst some people who are reporting their experiences with xenophobia and racism, that some of them are saying, some of them are framing it through a lens of surprise and shock. And some have even said things along the lines of, I never thought that this would happen to me. You know, we thought that Chinese Americans, you know, we sort of believed in the model minority myth. We thought that Asian Americans were kind of, you know, safe from racism. And I think that what we're seeing in the wake of the virus is how vulnerable or fragile that model minority status really is. This isn't just something new. It's not just something that is related to the pandemic. It has to have come on and fed on this longer history of how we've discriminated against Asian Americans and treated them as outsiders. So for people within the community and those who are not members of the community, awareness is extremely important. Challenging these acts, if you see them, be a productive bystander. Protect our Asian American neighbors, healthcare workers, grocery store workers, etc., and then speak out and vote if you don't support politicians who are furthering this kind of anti-immigrant rhetoric and putting it into place into policies.
Thank you. A Smithfield Foods executive recently blamed the outbreak at their South Dakota plant on the living conditions of large groups of immigrants. What local or regional pushback are you seeing? And are there organizations that can support those of us who are combating this narrative?
I just saw that news report as well. So for those who may not have read it, it's clear that the region's two of the region's largest pork processing plants are now identified as having some of the largest outbreaks of COVID-19 cases. And a Smithfield spokesperson, when pushed to respond to the company's response to COVID-19, essentially blamed it on immigrants. This is a very common, well, first of all, it's a very common argument historically, as I've talked about earlier today, that immigrant populations have always been seen as being less than sanitary and being places that spread disease. But also this particular strategy, we should see it for what it is, and that seems to me to be a deflection of responsibility on the part of the company to actually protect its own workers. So what can we do? We can support reporting that further digs deeper into this situation, and I'm sure this is not the only factory or workplace that is will have found to be faulty in protecting its workers. And we can identify organizations that are helping to support healthcare and essential needs for these workers as well.
Okay, thank you. Do you think that people in America are viewing Indian, Nepalese, Bangladesh, or Southern Asian neighbors in the same light and are they experiencing something similar, or is it mostly just East and Southeast Asians?
That's an excellent question. I think right now that it's a mixture of two things. One, it does seem, because of the political rhetoric and this focus on China as the source of the first case reported for the epidemic, and then the political rhetoric blaming China for the spread of the virus. I think what we're seeing today is that most of the victims seem to be those who are assumed to be Chinese and Chinese appearing rather than South Asian. But as I mentioned earlier, this really is part of a larger anti-immigrant narrative and nativist narrative, meaning that a protect America or Americans first kind of narrative. And so while these COVID-19 hate crimes might be directed more towards one Asian or Asian American appearing population, I think that the fallout, including these larger sort of bans on immigration, are really going to be impacting all immigrant communities.
Thank you very much. Oops, I had one here. Okay, so considering the history of Asian racism in the US, what is your opinion on the most effective way for the Asian community to respond with faced harassment? And what protects our physical safety, but also moves the needle on challenging these anti-Asian perspectives?
The response is has been one of a source of debate. Participants might already have read about or know about the attempt by former presidential candidate Andrew Yang, who had a Washington Post op-ed in which I think he was trying to respond to the rise in hate crimes within or targeting the Asian American community. His response was essentially, we need to show our Americanness more than ever. We need to show our patriotism more than ever. We need to donate more. And the op-ed was a source of quite a lot of debate, with people from lots of different backgrounds really going after Yang and saying, first, this assumes that we aren't already American. Another perspective was, we're continually being asked to prove ourselves. And like, how much more do you want from us? We are already on the front lines of the healthcare crisis. We're already, doing this X, Y, and Z. And historically, when Asian Americans have been asked more than other groups to prove our loyalty, it has come at such great costs. This is essentially the rhetoric that was framing the decision to incarcerate Japanese Americans, that they had to prove their loyalty. And within the Japanese American community in World War II, the leadership said, this is essentially, we have to do this. This is a bitter pill for us to do, but we should comply, because this is the only way that we can prove our loyalty, by giving up everything and relocating forcibly, out of our homes into camps. And we need to prove our loyalty even more by volunteering for the draft and being placed in some of the most dangerous military campaigns during the war. So the response, I think that Yang's opinion is not the most productive response, and it also just assumes and kind of feeds into this idea that Asian Americans are not already patriotic and loyal Americans. What we can do, I think, again, there's so much feeling of helplessness in this pandemic right now. I think we all just have to find ways of identifying what our unique talents are, and helping our neighbors and each other in the best way possible. This is my expertise. I'm not a healthcare worker. I cut up some pillow closet and pillowcases and hand-sewn masks for my family, you know. So I have very limited skill set. This is what I'm choosing to do and share. I think we all need to think about how we can best contribute. I know I left, you know, I ended my presentation with what other Asian American organizations are doing through education, through support, through dialogue, but especially through action. So I think the helplines are really important, and just being aware of what's going on and stopping this behavior and acts of hate when you see it, and then again, organizing and letting our votes count when it matters.
Thank you. The naturalization process today still requires medical check, including STD screening. Is there historical evidence that these medical checks prevent the spread of disease? Should there be a movement to resist or eliminate this requirement?
That's a great question. I think that what we're seeing in the contemporary immigration process is a reflection of how deeply rooted that relationship between immigrant and disease has been, and how institutionalized they have been. I think that there's so much that needs to be overhauled with the contemporary immigration system. I would not be surprised if some of these public health checks are also part of that restructuring or reform. I don't think that that's going to happen right away, simply because we are in a pandemic, and if what we're hearing from the medical experts is really the best way forward, it's that we are, all of us, immigrants and non-immigrants, are likely going to be asked to be tested for various different symptoms much more often and in much more different places than we have been before, like they have been doing in many other countries, meaning we'll probably be asked to get our temperatures checked before entering into a large crowded area. So I think that public health policies is certainly going to be one of those things that is on the table as we think about restructuring the immigration system and the way immigration works. But right now, the policies are such that there is likely going to be very little immigration right now. So we'll have to see about that.
Thank you. What advice can you give local business leaders for what they might do within their organizations to fight this narrative, perhaps particularly at a distance at this stay-at-home time?
Again, I think that one of the things is simply awareness, and then thinking about from one's own perspective. So business leaders, if you're thinking about your own business networks and who's within your network, are there Asian-owned businesses that have lost income and traffic because, as we've seen throughout the country, people are associating the disease with Asian people, businesses, spaces, etc. So we know that, for example, Chinese restaurants have reported a great loss of income, or Asian-owned groceries have experienced a great loss of foot traffic because of this narrative of Asian people, Asian spaces, and the coronavirus. So thinking about how, as a business owner, you might reach out to Asian business associations or even particular businesses to ask if there's anything that one can do. I know that there are so many organized efforts to support restaurants, to support takeout and curbside delivery. There are also community organized, sort of supports for Asian-owned businesses and restaurants as well. I know of some in Massachusetts that I've read about, and I know that there's efforts locally as well.
Thank you. Racism and discrimination have existed in the US for centuries, as you have very carefully pointed out. Do you think Americans will continue to follow this action for another century, or do you feel that there is a place in time that this might stop in the future?
I get asked this question a lot, and I feel so torn about it, because like everybody, I want to offer hope, and I want to see hope, and I simply, as a human being, I I want to think that we have the power to change. Unfortunately, well, I will end with a hopeful note, but let me get back to the historical part. Joan mentioned that I just recently published a book on the history of xenophobia, and it's the 4th book I've written. All of the other books, when I've gotten to the end, the epilogue, I kind of have this pattern of saying, this is a really dark history. It's a really unfortunate history. We need to know more about how this happened, so that we can, not repeat it, so that we can truly live up to our ideals as a nation of immigrants. And after writing this book that delved much more deeply and broadly into the history of xenophobia and racism across the centuries, going back to the colonial era, and then across all of these different groups, I really didn't feel like I could responsibly say, and it will get better. Especially because when we look at the domestic trends, as well as the global trends, what we're seeing in the United States today with our nationalist, nativist, and xenophobic policies is not, first of all, it's not just a Trump situation. It's been built over the centuries and helped to be put in place even by President Obama's administration, but also because globally we're seeing these anti-immigrant actions and narratives and policies happening around the world at the same time that the need is so great. There's record numbers of displaced persons and refugees. So I honestly, don't know. I don't know. I have less hope than I did before I wrote the book. But the one thing that does give me hope is that when I have participated in, and certainly have been keeping track of, the challenges to at least our national immigration policies put in place in the past few years, whether it be the lawyers who went to the airport spontaneously when the Muslim ban was first signed, to the protests that bring all sorts of people. So a protest in Minneapolis that is challenging the Muslim ban will also bring people from outside of the Muslim community. The protests that challenged detention of children in detention centers brought a huge range of people to the streets. And I know that that is something different that has not happened before historically. I know that in previous cases, when the Chinese were excluded, when Japanese Americans were forced out of their homes, when Mexican Americans were forcibly removed, there was very little public response. And so the fact that there are so many people who are aware and who are protesting and challenging these policies does give me hope that when we come out of this, that we will be able to turn the tide on this anti-immigrant mood that we're in.
Thank you. So what can, and two questions were asked, but one is education. What role should education, higher education, but also K-12 education play in addressing the problem of xenophobia?
I think I'm going to answer that in the same way, because I think regardless of what grade or age your teaching, we all as educators and those in higher education have to be aware of the impact, large and small, that this political climate is having on our students. So I personally, when I'm teaching at the University of Minnesota, most of my students are first generation immigrant and refugee. And I also have tutored local high school students. And I know that in the past 3 years, the underlying emotion or thought or expression that they've shared with me is one of fear. Fear of being deported, fear of being victims of hate crimes, fear of being separated from their families. I was helping a high school student write her college essay, and I was trying to encourage her to write a very personal essay, you know, tell the college admission committee who you are, how, you know, the brave journey that you took, how you taught yourself English from board books at the local library with the help of, you know, a library tutor, and how here you are about to graduate high school. And she turned to me and she said, but isn't refugee a bad word? You know, shouldn't I keep that out? And, you know, I almost broke down there. So I think that, and I was on a recent webinar with a specialist in education, and especially for immigrant youth. And the message that she had was this internalization. So this sort of goes back to that very first question that was asked. We may not be victims of a brutal hate crime with the acid thrown in our face, but it doesn't make what we're experiencing, this larger sort of and deep narrative of anti-immigrant sentiment less damaging. This this educational specialist did a survey of middle school age children, and the question was a sort of open form answer. The question was, you know, most Americans think my group is blank. And the vast majority of responses were, you know, most Americans think my group is lazy, is gangs, you know, our gangs are dirty. They were all negative responses. So we have to, as educators, whether it's the elementary school or whether it's the college students, we have to be aware of how, again, the xenophobic climate and this history that we're living in, how it impacts the internal you know, mechanisms and just the soul, let alone all of the essential needs that our students are going to be facing and are facing during this economic crisis as well. Immigrant and marginalized communities, as we've seen with the virus, are always doubly or even triply impacted during times of crisis, and will have to be able to respond flexibly to their needs moving forward.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more, and I'm trying to blend a couple of the comments here, but we know COVID-19 is proportionately impacting the Black American community, and that's forced us to look at this historical disinvestment in those communities. But is there any thoughts about connections to that particular racism and the anti-Asian racism or anti-immigrant racism?
Absolutely, it's all structural as well. So when we're thinking about our jails and prisons, we know that the disproportionate members of Black and Brown communities are in prison. We know that disproportionately marginalized populations have less healthcare access. we especially know that, as I mentioned, with the laws first put into place in the 1990s, that undocumented immigrants are not allowed access to public health benefits. And we also know that certain policies being passed by this administration, largely the public health, public charge clause, that makes it harder for poor immigrants to qualify for legal status, that those laws are also discouraging people from accepting health or seeking out healthcare help. And as we know with the virus, you know, we need everyone to be healthy. So this is not just an issue of certain communities being impacted and we're going to be willing to let those communities suffer on their own. We are all in this together, and we all need to be healthy, and each other's health and well-being is interconnected to our own.
Okay, with that, I'd like to thank you for this phenomenal presentation. We really appreciate your time today and your willingness to answer so many questions. I want to remind everybody the presentation will be recorded and online shortly, so you can certainly view it again there. Thank you to Dean McQuaid for joining us as well today. And everybody have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.